Every horror fan remembers the first time they were terrified watching a movie. Your hands clench at the edge of your seat, your eyes scatter like marbles, and as the scare hits you, you feel like that one unlucky dude in Ridley Scott's Alien. But somehow as horror fans, even though describing this horrific feeling would leave you wondering why you'd never ever come back again, we always do. So today I want to talk about the movie that truly opened the doors for me as a film fan and got me into my favourite genre. This movie opened a whole new world of exciting film knowledge and excitement for me, whilst also being a really imaginative and creative idea that often gets looked down on, and we can use this movie to learn as writers how we can elevate a concept. Today we're going to talk about Don Mancini's brainchild, the horror movie Child's Play. I know, you're probably wondering why I hold this series in such a high regard when movies like The Exorcist, The Omen, or Halloween exist. Of all the horror movies released around this time and even today, I can truly say that without a doubt there is no other franchise quite like the Child's Play franchise. In case you're uninitiated, Child's Play tells the story of a young boy named Andy Barclay who wants nothing more than a good guy doll for his birthday. Through various hijinks and a really dickish boss, his struggling single mother Karen manages to get him one who wants nothing more than to be Andy's friend to the end.
Hi, I'm Andy. What's your name? Hi, I'm Chucky, and I'm your friend to the end. Heidi-ho.
But here's a curveball. Chucky is not a real doll. I mean, technically he is, but whilst every other good guy doll is only programmed to say 3 sentences and nod, this one is possessed by the recently deceased serial killer Charles Lee Ray. The killings ensue, and it turns out that in order to not be trapped within the doll, Chucky must transfer his soul into Andy, and thus a great hero-villain relationship was born. Now we can't talk about Child's Play without mentioning this man, Don Mancini. I already don't think writers get enough credit that they should in Hollywood compared to actors or directors, and Mancini is definitely responsible for influencing parts of the kind of storyteller I would eventually become. This is a man who was just like us, a simple film student who loved the horror genre, particularly the killer doll trope. On coming up with the idea for the series, he had this to say.
I wanted to write something that was a dark, satirical look about the world of children's marketing. In my original script, the doll is actually a sort of supernatural manifestation of the boy's id. So the doll is specifically going out and striking out against the people that this kid feels this unexpressed rage toward.
And even now, dolls in horror movies were usually considered to just be silent, stoic, and they may have a creepy stare and occasionally yell out a little demon's curse for a little scare to the audience. Chucky is far from this. Whilst he does have that creepy nature about him, I think it takes real creativity and imagination to turn what is usually no more than a prop into a fleshed out character with a personality, quirks, and an incredible laugh. I really admire Don Mancini for pushing the envelope regarding this, even if it didn't turn out the way he initially intended.
I really did like the idea of the story, but there were elements to me that were missing. But what was very important to me was to really give more of a specific to the central villain of the story.
Something no one ever prepares you for as a writer is changing your work. If you want to be successful in the writing industry, it's gonna happen. It happens to authors, it happens to screenwriters, it's just part of the process. When you're a beginner, this can be quite daunting and freak you out. Your baby that you've worked on so hard isn't quite there yet and needs to be altered slightly in order to be sellable. Now this has happened to me countless times, and the best advice I can give you is to listen, take a step back, and determine whether it's the right choice, because, that's your call. Sometimes, and most times, change can improve the story you were trying to tell, and you'll wonder why you even did it in the original way in the first place. If it doesn't work out, guess what? There's other agents, you'll get there. But back to Child's Play, I would have loved to have read Don Mancini's original script, but sadly it's not available anymore. Just as well what we got is just as interesting. See, whilst others may view Child's Play as a silly slasher about a killer doll that curses, I view it as much more than that. Don Mancini's original plan was to tell a story satirizing the capitalism of children's marketing within toy sales. You can even see that at play in the series. It's clear no one behind the good guy dolls is really interested in the dolls themselves. They just want to rake them out in factories and sell them for $100 a piece. They know kids will buy them, so there it is. They don't care about anything else regarding the doll. So put yourself in Andy Barclay's shoes. When you're that young, especially if you're not the kind of kid who finds it easy to make friends, your toys end up becoming your friends. It's a feeling we can all relate to. You won't find anything more cute and innocent in a horror movie than the opening scene of Child's Play introducing Andy Barclay's character and his early interactions with Chucky. But here's where I think Child's Play gets very interesting. The actual good guy doll is supposed to represent innocence, to capture it in a way, to sell it and brand it. Even the original settings of the good guy doll are completely devoid of any personality, only able to say 3 sentences. That's not the case with Chucky, and now we can talk about the other man responsible for Child's Play's large success.
Eddie, help me! Eddie, don't leave me! God, no!
Brad Dourif is one of my favorite actors, and he has such an incredible charisma and sick charm in both roles he plays within Child's Play. As the serial killer Charles Lee Ray, we get to see a completely evil man showing vulnerability and weakness for the first time, knowing he's about to die. Even though he's a villain, realizing your life is coming to an end unless you do something about it would be terrifying. And Brad Dourif's performance decides to take this in a really fun direction by having him say lines like this.
You hear that, you son of a bitch? I'm gonna get you, and I'm gonna get Eddie, no matter what!
Dourif nails it with a bit of vulnerability as well. And when we get to see him voicing Chucky, his performance takes on a whole other level. It's like God mode, and then he turns this potentially silly doll character into one of the most charismatic and entertaining villains in the horror franchise, when your doll sounds like a gangster from Queens spouting out shit like this.
Hi, it's me, Chucky. What do you think? The gree work?
Dourif consistently brought it with this character and clearly had an absolute blast portraying him. Fun fact for you comic book fans out there, before Jack Nicholson was cast, Brad Dourif was considered by Tim Burton to portray the Joker in 1989's Batman, and there was also a rumour of him playing the Scarecrow in one of Burton's future Batman movies, but sadly that never came to be. I for one think he would have been perfectly cast in either role. The other person we can't fail to mention is Tom Holland. No, not Spider-Man, this Tom Holland. He directed horror movies such as Fright Night, the sequel to Psycho, and this, and many others in the future. Fright Night showed that he was great at directing dark atmosphere and terror, all whilst having fun with the audience along the way, and he brings even more of that to Child's Play. Each scene with Chucky involved is filmed with such tension, but then quickly flips the switch into being darkly funny. But it never loses track of that balance. Later movies in the series like Bride and Seed of Chucky would end up leering more towards the comical side of the series, but for my money the original trilogy strikes that balance in the best way. However, one of the things that always gets people hating on the horror genre is this generalized idea that they're just 90 minutes of watching characters you don't care about get killed by ultimately more interesting villains, and you know, that's true for some series, but I don't think Child's Play is one of them. So let's look at some of the victims in the original Child's Play. Spoilers ahead, obviously. Aunt Maggie, the first victim of Chucky, is Karen Barclay's best friend, and we quickly see how friendly and helpful she is to Karen whilst also being a bit of a smartass, thus making her quite likeable. Her relationship with Andy seems friendly enough even though she consistently lets him know who's boss, and she sadly meets her end by getting struck with a hammer whilst babysitting Andy and falling out of the window. Eddie Caputo is our next victim, who's Charles Lee Ray's former partner, and who Chucky spends a large part of the movie searching for in order to gain revenge. This guy barely has any dialogue, yet I can tell he's probably a selfish loner without any family to go back to, and incredibly on the edge. He meets his end when Chucky turns on the gas in his rundown hideout and blows himself up. Up next we have John, who we quickly get to know as the guy who taught Charles Lee Ray all the voodoo stuff. From their quick banter together, we get a sense that they probably shared a decent enough friendship, but John is absolutely terrified by what he's helped create, and he quickly realizes that he must rectify it any way he can. Unlucky for him, this is what gets him killed, but I will give John props in that all of the victims of this movie, he's most definitely the bravest and the only one who's willing to stand up to Chucky at first. And even in his death, he gives the secret of what will eventually kill Chucky. Our final victim is my favourite within the original movie, and it's this creepy, overly friendly doctor guy who obviously doesn't believe Andy's claims that Chucky is alive and is trying to kill him. He serves as the adult character who gets his comeuppance for not trusting the kid and gaslighting him at every chance he gets. In one of the most graphic kills in the movie and series, Chucky stabs him in the leg and straps him into an electroshock therapy machine, turning up the volts until he's fried to a crisp. It's kind of sadistic how Chucky is continuously laughing during this scene, enjoying it, and whilst Andy is determined to try and make Chucky stop, his begs and his pleas slowly fade away and get quieter in the background, clearly showing the trauma of what he's just seen. And that's really good directing and really good acting on Alex Vincent's part. The final battle with Chucky's pretty cool in this one, dark and ominous and full of some pretty great atmospheric tension and scares, and they even employed a little person actor in order to make Chucky seem like he was moving more authentically around the apartment, as opposed to just using an animatronic. It's stuff like this that I really appreciate in horror movies as opposed to just fixing everything in post. Chucky almost wins, but it's ultimately Andy who brings about his big defeat in the movie, finally showing how much he's grown and doesn't need a good guy doll to be his friend anymore. Especially when it's a murderous killer, but it's cool nonetheless, and Brad Dourif's pain screams really sell this moment. Of course, in typical horror movie fashion, Chucky's not dead and comes back later. And he looks even more terrifying, all burnt up, but he's ultimately defeated at the end by Mike Norris, who's another cool character. And the final shot of the movie really sums up everything about why I think this movie elevated its concept. Look at how broken little innocent Andy Barclay is. Even though Chucky is dead for now, this is something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. See, on paper this does sound extremely silly, but I believe you can take concepts that sound silly and still execute them in an entertaining and exciting way. As long as you balance the serious stakes and nature of the story with a lighthearted fun along the way, don't veer too quickly into one side or the other, because otherwise you get stuff like this. I really have to give props to Don Mancini, Brad Dourif, Tom Holland, Alex Vincent, and really the entire cast and crew of this movie for making it work. No one here thinks they're above the material, and it took some real passion and creativity to make this concept believable and entertaining to a modern horror audience at the time. What could have been an overcomplicated story about blood brothers and psychological ideas of children became a really slick slasher about how innocence is overcome by the presence of evil. And even though innocence may win in the end, evil doesn't just go away like that. It always comes back in some form. Child's Play 2 even shows Andy dealing with PTSD, Chucky becoming increasingly more sadistic, and for my money contains the best final sequence of the series, and possibly my top one in slasher movies. See, it's not just the concept that makes Child's Play work, it's the execution. And I have a feeling that the team might have known this story might not have been taken seriously amongst more straight-up horror films like The Shining or The Omen, and thus, they worked so hard to ensure it wasn't just staying as a silly story about an evil doll. The victims in this movies have personalities, stories, and even in their limited screen time, we immediately get a sense of who they are and why they exist the way they do within the story, and depending on what you might feel about them will determine your feelings on their death scenes, and this also continues as part of the original trilogy. It's important for you as a writer to recognize that you shouldn't hold back within your creativity. Anything as a story is possible within reason. Obviously, just throwing silly things out there for the sake of being different won't win you any points, but taking a concept like this and building a fascinating and unique world and cast of characters around it will always get you there in the end. What you ultimately choose to write about, I feel, is more important than any decision made about how you write it. This concept could have worked in a few different ways, as seen by the many different takes on Chucky we've seen in the movies, but what the best ones have always remembered is what the story is about. And that when it's at its strongest, when it's a story about evil taking over innocence and the devastation it can cause for both the victims and the main characters going forward, all of that is wrapped up in a story about a kid and his killer doll possessed by a serial killer. And isn't that kind of awesome? That something that sounds so weird and so ridiculous could have such great layers as it does. Whilst I do understand if you think Child's Play is too silly, I will always say it is way smarter than people give it credit for. It just isn't the kind of movie that tells you how smart it is, it's a movie that shows you how smart it is, whilst keeping you entertained along the way. The perfect balance in my eyes. So if you're a writer with wild concepts, please don't hold back. If this team of creators can make a concept like Chucky work and be believable, you can do the same thing. So get on it, write it, and have a blast. Don't be worried about it being too ridiculous, because speaking from experience, you'll feel amazing after it's done. That is how I believe Don Mancini and Tom Holland elevated this concept, and it's why Child's Play will always hold a special place in my heart as the first horror film I ever really loved. It's my horror movie, Friend to the End.